Now, the world that we live in is full of risks. And I think as we look at the growing potential and the growing number of things in the world to consider, I think we agree that the number of risks are increasing as well. How do we mitigate that? Well, this is where our next panel, or this is what our next panel is going to be addressing. We're talking about mitigating digital risk in an age of uncertainty. Our panelists this morning are Brigadier General Gaurav Keerthi, who's the Deputy Chief Executive, Cybersecurity Agency of Singapore; Lucas Goh, IT Director, Infrastructure and Operations at Volex; Darren Argyle, Group Chief Information Security Risk Officer, Standard Chartered Bank; Gareth Cox, Vice President of APJ Exabeam; Sheriff El Nabawi, Vice President Asia Pacific and Japan Sales Engineering and Service Provider Sales, CrowdStrike Asia Pacific and Japan. And our moderator for this session is the Principal Advisor at CIO Academy Asia, Andrew Milroy.
So good afternoon, everybody. I have to say I'm delighted to be here, and thanks for the introduction, Joe. And it's great to be here to talk about digital risk. It's often a topic that's somewhat overlooked as people focus on basically keeping the lights on, keeping their businesses running. So what we've seen since the beginning of the pandemic is a massive acceleration in digitization for organizations. So we've seen, obviously, the remote operating model becoming more commonplace, so a lot more endpoints being used to access resources. We've seen a rush to using the cloud to a much greater extent, and way more digital engagement as we're doing in this kind of hybrid digital environment now as we speak. But we've just seen this huge shift. And often what we find is security takes a back seat as people focus on just keeping things operating. And what we're going to talk about today is the extent to which companies are addressing the increased digital risk that they're facing as a result of these changes, the massively expanded attack surface that they're having to deal with. What are companies doing? What measures are they taking? And another important factor that we'll be talking about is how digital risk can be talked about in a way the business understands. Very often it's something that is discussed using very technical terminology. There's a lot of acronyms and abbreviations used, and often not in a way that focuses purely on business risk, operational risk, reputational risk, litigation risk, and so forth. So I'm delighted to be joined by a very distinguished panel to talk about some of these issues. And I'd like to start perhaps with Gaurav. So Gaurav, perhaps you can tell us a little bit about some of the digital risks we've been seeing more of in Singapore since the pandemic, and what organizations are doing about it.
Thanks so much, Andrew. You mentioned that things are moving a lot faster. I'll build on that theme and tell the audience about two specific things we've observed. The first happened slightly before the pandemic, and this was that the whole issue of cybersecurity became not just a technical issue, but a business issue and even a geopolitical issue. And that happened abruptly. I don't think anybody expected cybersecurity to be at the level of salience and prominence that it is today 3 years ago. To have heads of state talk about the specific cybersecurity of specific technologies, nobody expected that. So it became geopolitically, internationally very salient. That's the first thing that accelerated. The second thing that accelerated, and specific to COVID, is that digitization just took off. It was a necessity. It was a survival need. Whether you're a company, whether you're a country, you needed to digitize very quickly in order to adapt. Especially for the context of working from home, companies had to put in place technologies to enable their employees to access office place equipment, systems, information very quickly. The problem with doing things very quickly is that you don't have time to think about those risks. We don't have the opportunity to sit there and discuss how to put that balance in place between usability, security, and this age of uncertainty just happened upon us. There was no way to think about mitigating those risks. So as to what companies are doing about it, I would love to hear from the rest, but what we're seeing in Singapore is that companies started the digitization and they're now starting to think about how to secure that digitization. They've had to go in, but now they're thinking about what the consequences of that decisions have been.
So it's coming second. Thanks for that, Gaurav. So perhaps I could ask Darren a question, specifically relating to the banking industry. I mean, obviously, cybersecurity is a big issue for financial services firms, has been for a long time. So Darren, how has the change to remote working, the shift in the way people are using technologies over the last 9 months affected the cybersecurity posture that you have?
Yeah, I think we all agree the pandemic has had significant impact on business, but also on personal lives, quite dramatically across the world in terms of restrictions, both in movement and some of the ways that they can work. But we also acknowledge, in terms of acceleration of the digital agenda, that has just been pretty much extreme. And we've seen this manifest itself in the bank in the way that we interact with one another as employees and even with our third parties, but also the behaviors of our customers in the way that they interact with the bank and our products. So according to at least one report, and there's many reports very similar to this, we've seen a jump in over 200% observed in new mobile banking registrations since April of this year. And mobile banking traffic has rose to 85%. So this has accelerated things like the adoption of contactless payment, for example. And now we're seeing a preference over e-payments versus the use of cash. And at Standard Chartered, we've already been responding to the greater needs of digital technology. We launched actually in digital-only banks in Africa from, I think it's about 8 we have in Africa. And in September of 2020, this year, we also launched a new digital-only bank called MOX in Hong Kong. And to secure some of those new digital banks that we've delivered on, we're using things like secure APIs for dynamic exchange of transactions in the financial systems. In fact, the entire ecosystem in which we engage in. And this has not only delivered improved service to our customers, such as things like onboarding within only 15 minutes, which is, you agree is pretty good for a bank in terms of that transaction, but also integrating seamless security behind the scenes so that we can deliver confidence in some of those new banking platforms. And that also includes things like improving things like authentication and verification. So I think you mentioned actually at the start when you said, is security taking a back seat? Well, it's not been my experience at the bank that we are taking a back seat in any regard, actually. And far from taking a back seat, we're understanding that the digital transformation and confidence of our customers goes hand in hand. So what we're trying to do is obviously continue to maintain that sustainable trust over the longer term, and availability of customer services 24/7 is expected. So defending against things like DDoS attacks and other service attacks, but also using the latest encryption techniques is important as well. We're also seeing from a lot of the attacks, and we've seen a surging attacks against the bank actually, as I know many other organizations have. Just on phishing attacks alone, we've seen a surge of 31% since the start of the year. And we're observing not just, I think across the industry, this rise in ransomware attacks as well against many of the third-party suppliers, which we are hoping, are able to maintain their key control posture, given some of the difficulties that lots of companies are having with remote working, which is stretching, people quite thinly. And the last thing I think is worth highlighting is also the rise of automation that is important from the bank more holistically, but we're also seeing attackers using this in terms of AI and machine learning for speeding up some of those attacks. So digital agenda for an attacker is also being useful for them. So we've got to respond in combining our techniques to respond to that. And the last thing I just want to close out on, I think, is we talk a lot about the digital agenda and technology being really important, but it's also crucially important that we maintain education of our people, both at the leadership levels, our cyber leadership skills, so that they can negotiate the introduction of these new capabilities seamlessly, education for the business and executives, and increasingly the board as well, because we talked about this being a business agenda. And for many of those teams who are having to deploy lots of innovative tooling into these new environments so that we can maintain the digital agenda in light of the automation from many of our attackers.
Great, thank you so much for that, Darren. So maybe Lucas, if I could ask you, a similar question. So at Volex, what are you guys doing, to address some of the changing threats, the expanded attack surface? What measures are you putting in place?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Andrew. So Volex, we do with a global exposure of the risk itself. So definitely in the different factories and different levels of people that we have in the company throughout the entire global scale, it has a different challenges. Like a simple, even like a policy or even education itself. Do we do it in one common language? Do we do it in 7 different languages? That plays a big factor. So one of the key things that we have done to address the digital risk, and I like the word digital risk, so that it becomes more clear that it is a business issue. It's not just an IT or cybersecurity risk itself. So we have formed up a committee. I think that's one basic that most companies should have, whether is it a big, large MNC or even SME itself, because you start to realize that this is not something that an IT, a CIO, or even a CISO can take the lead itself, but you need to involve all aspects of the business to have that committee, to have that conversation, and then you really decide as a company, as a business, what level of risk you're willing to take already stuff. And through my experience for the past maybe 18 months, I would say, it's really an eye-opener to realize in order to communicate the risk to different aspects of the business, you have to use different approach yourself. You have to probably be a bit more creative. I can give an example. The way a CFO see a risk and the way a COO see a risk itself is very different. It's the same risk that we're seeing, but the results are totally different and stuff. One is looking at numbers, one's looking at downtime, uptime of the factories and stuff. So I think this is a very key, important step that we've taken, where we involve different aspects of the business to get involved in the conversation. So I think earlier when Darren mentioned, one key thing that we did much earlier was also education. We realized that was something a lot of companies think is you do it once a year, everybody sign off on the compliance form, and that should be good enough. So I think we realized that that is probably a baseline to start with, but it's definitely not good enough. So threats are emerging daily, they're evolving as you speak. And if your employees, your environment, if they're not familiar with it or they're not conscious of it, they're not aware of it, stuff, you can put in a lot of investments, but they're all going to find different loopholes around it.
So the people element is very important, the people and process element you're describing there.
Yep, the PPT is really important about it itself. But I also like to highlight that even you have that in place itself, you really need to consider what kind of technologies can you use to enhance the PPT itself. So being aware is one thing, but if everything can be just done with education and policies, then there wouldn't be need for technologies, isn't it? So, yeah.
Thanks for that, Lucas. So maybe Sharif, I could ask you a question. One of the obviously big changes we've seen in since the pandemic kicked off and disrupted everything that we know, we've just seen this huge upsurge in the number of endpoints that large organizations have to deal with. And I know, in many ways, this is an area that CrowdStrike focuses on. So what are you guys doing to help organizations secure those endpoints and manage the risk associated with that expanded surface?
Definitely. Thanks for that. So I think the first point is, throughout this journey in the last 8 months with the pandemic, what we've seen is there's a lot of organizations that had to shift literally overnight. So even their digital transformation plans that were planned for a year, 2, 3, 4, had to literally happen in 1 week. With that came the part of, well, I need to apply the same ways of security that I had used previously, which was a challenge because the time to value to get that visibility into those thousands of endpoints that they had to roll out overnight. And the majority of them didn't even have supply chain to basically send company laptops that are configured to their employees. So what they did is said, we're going to allow access through your own devices, which introduced a completely different level of risk. On top of that as well, the home Wi-Fi's, unsecured home Wi-Fi. So with CrowdStrike, what we did is the time to value is key because there's no deployment methodology that relies on anything that's on premises or hybrid. So whether they ship those laptops or whether they just use the same that they have at home, we just had an agent that connects direct to the cloud to give them immediate visibility. So we had a case, specifically one of the largest banks in Australia that went with us, and overnight we had more than 70,000 endpoints that they had to do the same to. So the in 48 hours we deployed all the agents on all of them, which helped them get the visibility and security they needed overnight. Of course, back to the point, that is not enough. You need also, top of that, not only the people awareness of your employees, because it's very different at a time of pandemic. All the studies show that even the one that were aware before and were not clicking the links are now more likely to, when it comes with a WHO or an authority in health organization, speaking to the latest pandemic rates or health or anything that's related to our fear and uncertainty. So the aspect of awareness is important. But on top of all this, whatever is missed by any technology needs to be gathered by threat hunters. So whether you had that capability as an organization internally, or whether you would rely on a third party to do the threat hunting of the type of intrusions and campaigns that are way beyond sophistication level of that, basically that are using legitimate, legitimate tools on your operating system. So that would add as well. So as CrowdStrike, we also helped our customers with what we call our managed services capability through the complete team and through the Overwatch threat hunters as well, on top of the technology.
Thanks so much for that, Sharif. So maybe I could, bring Gareth into the conversation. So I guess this changing landscape is having a big impact on security operations centers and the way they're handling this work. Obviously, there's a lot more going on, a lot more alerts, no doubt, and it's becoming, an increasing challenge for analysts to handle. How can the Security Operations Center adjust to manage these changes, and what kind of analytics and automation do you think they need?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Since COVID, there's been a huge change on workplace. Obviously, people working in their offices are now going remote, and some of the challenges with remote working and devices. But also, as mentioned by Darren, the number of phishing attacks have increased drastically. And phishing attacks are really focused on stealing credentials, so people can actually log into your sanctioned cloud services where your data is, or log into your network, or log in to gather information on that. With an analyst, trying to figure out what is normal is very tough before they can find out what is abnormal. So what you need to do is combat that in the same way as the adversary is doing if they're using machine learning, is use machine learning and models to understand what is normal and abnormal, and help your analysts understand what is happening within a whole supply chain of an attack. Most cases, what we see at Exabeam is that we'll get an alert from, let's say for CrowdStrike, we later in the chain will give us a lot more valuable, rich information for our timeline, but we would actually pick up when, for example, Gareth clicked on a link and started accessing information I've never accessed before. It downloaded information I've never touched before from a country I've never visited before, or a company before. So using machine learning to help the analysts do the triaging, and that's the hardest work what an analyst does, is what we're seeing most of is augmentation of SOCs with machine learning to help analysts identify what is abnormal and normal.
Thanks so much for that, Gareth. I see we have some questions coming through. Maybe I can ask Gaurav a question here that we've received. Cyber defense at the national level is often enforced more by the stick than the carrot. Any carrots to motivate leadership boards to make more investments into cybersecurity? Gaurav.
Thanks for the question. I suppose it is true that what most people see is things like the Cybersecurity Act in Singapore, which is a very strong stick. It basically says if we think you're an essential service, a critical information infrastructure provider, we think that you need to uphold a certain level of standards, and there are some fairly harsh sticks in the Act to make sure that they comply. What people don't see actually is that there's a parallel track that happens to that. If we think that you are important enough in an essential service, providing an essential service through a digital system, we actually bring you into a community where we share with you a lot more knowledge, a lot more information about what we think the threats could be. We bring you into that trusted circle to encourage you to take these threats seriously. Specific incentives happen at two levels. At the small, medium enterprise level, we know that digitization is something they need to do, but cybersecurity is not often something that they know how to calibrate their own risk level for and how much to invest in it. So there are specific schemes to help SMEs, small, medium enterprises, to subsidize some of the acquisitions. We're thinking about actually building up architectures that allow various companies to provide different parts of the ecosystem of cybersecurity into a company and have that all work together without having expensive system integration come in. But this is at the SME level. At the bigger companies, part of the carrot is actually just telling the companies that this is your responsibility. And it's your responsibility because it makes sense for you. Many of the companies are starting to realize now that if they don't take cybersecurity as seriously as they should, actually it's a business cost to them. And you're starting to see, and I'm very happy about this, I saw an ad for an Apple iPhone on a bus stop that said, built with security. And you're like, that's fantastic. It's not about the camera, it's not about the speed, it's not about the apps. They are advertising that it's built with security, and that itself is a value proposition. To round this conversation off for my answer, we're starting to see manufacturers of smart devices, IoT devices, get more interested in security. And so in Singapore, we've launched something called the Cybersecurity Labeling Scheme, which basically is like a nutrition sticker that goes on the side of an IT box. So if you're buying a router, it has a sticker. It's either 1, 2, or 3, or 4-star device. We have some basic tests to determine what the quality of cybersecurity is for that device. What we're trying to tell consumers is buy more secure devices. And what we're trying to tell manufacturers is if you make more secure devices, you could probably charge a premium for a 4-star device, which today you can't because nobody knows what that means. So we're trying to put in the carrots in a clever way to encourage the consumers to want cybersecurity and the producers to give cybersecurity.
With labeling, right?
With labeling, yeah.
Okay, thanks so much for that. Gaurav, so we have another question coming in for Lucas and Sharif, so maybe I can start off by asking you, Lucas. The lines between information technology and operational technology have blurred as manufacturing floors smartify and digitize. How does this impact your security strategy, and what toolkits are required to secure smart devices at the edge?
That's a very good question. I mean, for me, of course, sadly, I'm in the position that I deal with both IT and OT on a daily basis. So for me, it's not a blur, but it's a requirement of my job already. So, but I wouldn't say it has impacted the strategy. In fact, it has enhanced or make it more important. Right now, when we have conversations about, like you say, smart devices into the manufacturing, so it's no longer like, let's get the devices in and then we think about how we're going to secure it. I think the conversation now is already, they know that they are supposed to get it secured first. We analyze, can we split up the networks? What is really required itself? What information is needed to be uploaded? So all these considerations and the budgeting nowadays actually being done before you bring the devices in and stuff. That's what I would say. So I wouldn't say how has it changed the strategy, but it actually brings the strategy much forward in the discussion with the OT level as well also. As for what is required to secure smart devices at the edge itself, I think one key point brought up earlier was, of course, there's the labeling programs, but I'm not too sure whether all countries have it at the moment and stuff. But I think it's definitely required if you have something that's able to at least detect and survey. To be honest, we are still doing a lot of POV with different vendors about it. This is still quite a pretty new area on how do you monitor and detect smart devices at the edge as well.
Thanks for that, Lucas. So the same question to you, Sharif. What toolkits are required to secure smart devices at the edge as we see the lines blurring between IT and OT?
Yeah, so first of all, as a vendor like CrowdStrike, we realized that our focus is on workloads, that being desktop, server, workload, container in the cloud. So what we do is we open our ecosystem to partner with IoT security vendors, and we basically share the telemetry and IOCs both ways. So that's one thing we do with customers that are having that line of OT and IT. But what we've seen as well with customers, that air gap that is always advertised between an IoT and never exists. Right? We always see that leak. So it helps always to have that open understanding between, if you're managing both, that's a much easier way to do it. But if it's different teams, we always get, so we bring in IoT experts as well, and OT experts to help us in that field. From a device perspective, we're focusing on everything that's workload. So we have also a strategy that's focused on IoT, but currently what we do is work with partners to secure that from a technology level on the strategy itself.
Okay, great. Okay, so just a reminder to people who want to ask questions. So don't use the chat box. Use Q&A and not the chat box for questions. But we have some other ones coming through. So I have another one for Darren. So Darren, in the advent of open banking, core banking services beyond retail products are being rapidly digitalized. Corporate and institutional banking doesn't, et cetera, et cetera. Does this actually make a difference to your cyber risk strategy? So I think the question is saying, does this move to open banking make a significant difference to your cyber risk strategy, and how?
Yeah, I think, well, one of the things that I think becomes crucially important, and I talked about this, I think earlier as well, is that you need to be adopting a secure by design strategy. I think everybody who's been in information and cybersecurity long enough will understand that that's a core principle. I think that becomes even more important when we move to a purely digital agenda, because of the speed at which you need to build a new infrastructure, which is that digital, in our case of digital banks. So it has to be something that's designed in at the front. There's also an added benefit of doing that as well, in that it's much more costly to bolt on security afterwards, and it's never as seamless as you do that. So one of the ways that we're obviously moving forward, and this was mentioned by a couple of speakers, was greater adoption of cloud. That goes without saying, but when you use cloud, then how can you use inherently secure principles to secure the interactions between clouds, customers, and multiple third parties? So this is where things like APIs become increasingly important. And the bank uses lots of secure APIs for secure dynamic data exchange and transactions across the entire financial ecosystem, which includes different third parties for like peer-to-peer payments, loans, overdraft, all those sorts of things. And in fact, the bank has formed an internal group-wide API strategy. So with security right at the center of that. But it also needs, collaboration with other organizations and third parties on APIs so that everybody's using it in a consistent way. So it's not about, certainly we see it in this bank, it's not about competition, it's collaboration really when it comes to information to cybersecurity. So information sharing becomes crucial, which is why we engage with multiple organizations, including other banks, to make sure that we're being consistent in our approach, particularly around things like APIs, which is crucial in an open banking economy in which we find ourselves in now.
Thank you, Darren. So we have a question here for Gareth. So Gareth, how can organizations deal with alert fatigue given the increasing number of alerts that they're dealing with and the increase in false positives?
Yeah, definitely. One of the main things what we see when we are doing proof of concepts or working with our clients is that we're looking at around 1,000 or so alerts per day of some analysts looking at these alerts, and there's just so much noise going through. And with the false positives, like I mentioned before, they don't understand what is normal. So if you look at a large organization, what has 20,000 employees, you do not know what half these employees do, what their job is, what applications they touch, and what activities they do, and where they log in from. So an analyst manually looking through all this information, it takes a long time, and it also has a lot of room for error because they're not able to see. What we do with our solution is we ingest solutions like CrowdStrike and like from any type of cloud service via APIs, and we do machine learning to reduce the number of noise. So instead of looking at 1,000 alerts from your SOC, we're pointing out 10 notable users or devices for an analyst to focus on based on risk profile of what someone is doing within that organization. Cisco is an investor in Exabeam, and most of their ELAs we get invited into, so then we can actually help them within the SOC to tie all the Cisco products together to have a single pane of glass for the analysts to look at. So machine learning is definitely the key on the automation side, is to run machine learning and models across all your alerts and all your system of record, cloud service providers, and also on-premise solutions.
Thanks for that, Gareth. So moving on to the next question that's coming in, and this is for Sharif, along the same lines as the question that Gareth just responded to. How can organizations streamline their telemetry data to reduce alert fatigue?
Great. So first of all, back to what Gareth was mentioning, I think a key aspect here is, although it's used in the industry a lot as a machine learning and AI, the reality is that's where the focus is, and having that in the cloud with different models allow you to apply a lot of extra calculation with very huge CPU and power storage and everything that allows you to get to results quicker. So by the time the analysts receive that CrowdStrike alert, it has been gone through all this. On top of this, has gone through the actual threat hunting capabilities where the actual human has looked into the high level. And we assign a crowd score, and at the same time a severity level to those alerts. So when we work with our partners like Exabeam, like Somologic, like any of the other ones where we feed the data into them, we also feed that severity level, and we feel also the IOCs, indication of compromise, which we get from our own threat intelligence internally. So combining all this results in the analyst having less in front of them so that they focus on the top alerts first. Another aspect is you have to relate it to your assets. From an IT operation point of view, which assets are core to you? Which ones I need to focus on? So with our module that we focus on in the IT operations side, and we look at that discovery line, we understand that, okay, we can allow you to do the actual understanding of which assets you need to focus on. So we will relate high important assets to the high severities and pop that up for the alert. And as an analyst, you need to look and focus your efforts on that first, because that is a key one. So tying the intelligence with the actual severity of the alert and the
to Gareth's earlier point, making triaging easier,
much better,
much more manageable.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we have a question for all of you guys here, and I guess it's very pertinent because one of the challenges in the cybersecurity / digital risk world, as we were talking about, is translating that into business risk and getting full buy-in and sponsorship, from the business around some of these risks and the necessary investments. So maybe I could start with you, Gaurav, with this question. So how can security leaders better engage their board leadership to continue sponsoring cybersecurity enhancement initiatives or get more money from them and awareness from them?
So I'm probably the wrong person to answer the question specifically.
Actually,
I strongly encourage all of the boards to consider cybersecurity seriously. But maybe I'll share a little bit about how we frame the conversation when we engage our own stakeholders. And we, like many other companies in the government, we have to persuade our own leadership, our politicians, our senior civil servants, that the balance of money that they spend on digitization versus cybersecurity, we have to go through these same dilemmas as well. How much do you want to spend on equipping people with digital tools versus securing those digital tools? So it's similar but slightly different. The way we think about it is it starts from the very basics of cybersecurity, your confidentiality, integrity, and availability. But we frame that in language that people can understand, and I guess building on Lucas's point, in language that they care about. Confidentiality, if this data, if this information is taken by somebody else, what does it matter to you? What is the impact of that to you? And we talk to people who care about the security of that information. They understand that. We talk about the integrity. If the data is modified in a way that changes the outcomes or changes the way that the systems work, what does that matter to you? And if you talk to a COO type of person in your organization, then they start to think, oh, actually, that's a big deal. If my factory floor is starting to churn out rubbish or it starts to create hazards for my employees, that's something I care about. Then you talk about availability. If all of our systems are locked down, if they're crippled by a ransomware attack, if they're crippled by some form of an attack that doesn't allow the system to be up, How does that impact you? And suddenly CEOs are like, well, I need my company to be up. I can't have this down. So you translate the very basic concepts of cybersecurity into language that each stakeholder understands. It might be different language, but if you can do that and convey the questions accurately, they sometimes come to the conclusion that they need to take it different. They need to take the responsibility much more seriously. They may all see the same risk and see it differently, but they all come to the conclusion that the risks need to be taken seriously.
Maybe I can ask Darren, how does this work at Standard Chartered? So, how do the security leaders there, how do you and your colleagues engage your board leadership to continue sponsoring your initiatives?
Yeah, I think it's pretty straightforward and tried and tested from as far as I'm concerned. It doesn't matter whether it's Standard Chartered Bank or any organization that I've worked in previously as a CISO. The principle that applies essentially is all around communication and making it as simple as possible so that the board, the executives, and even all the business leaders firstly understand the impact of a major cyber breach. And you can do that in many ways, and ultimately understand what their part is in that, so they feel some sense of ownership in what needs to be done right. And there are many ways that you can do that. Now, obviously, there are regular board meetings that happen. So when you go to a board meeting, you want to make sure that the message that you're conveying is clear, concise, so they understand what decisions they need to make. But then I think it's also important to start bringing it to life. And the way that you can bring it to life, in my experience, is doing things like regular cyber crisis simulations. And you engage the business leaders, board members, and executives in that, so they can understand the absolute impact of a major crisis on the bank. And it really does give them a sense of ownership in terms of what decisions need to be made. Because it's not just the decisions made of the CISO or the person responsible for security, but there's legal considerations, there's financial considerations, even in some cases, do we pay a ransom or not in terms of a major ransomware attack? And ultimately, the board are involved in any of that kind of decision making. So we need to run through multiple scenarios, and it's not just a one-off event. That's one aspect. Another way that you can really bring this to life, I found for executives, is to use things like red team testing. So we've got which might seem technical, and it is, but it really brings it to life for executives. So we kind of think of this more of a gamification exercise, really. So red team testing is all about the technical teams acting as attackers, and they might use technical or even psychological ways to infiltrate the organization. And the way that the thing that you're looking to do through that exercise is to test the friction of the security tooling that you deployed into the environment. So you're measuring the effectiveness of the controls that you've done that into the environment. But the way that you do that is through some very smart metrics. And the way that we've done this in the bank, and I know many organizations, is just using a very simple framework to give the lens of the attacker and the way that we could look at our metrics. You're basically going to be illustrating to the board and the businesses, what are the crown jewels, the things that we care about most? So understanding the attack surface, and we get them bought into that. And then it's all about how do we slow the attacker down through the various attack cycle, through an attack cycle. And then with that, starting to look at the metrics in terms of our ability to protect, detect, respond, recover. And when you get to the end of recover, which is a well-known NIST framework, is ultimately how do we do each of those areas at speed? And obviously when it comes to recover, if you're not recovering in a few days from a major ransomware attack, it can be existential and you can go out of business. That message given to a board or directors has a huge impact on the ability for them to make decisions in a timely manner, but also helps with budgeting and also long-term sustainability and momentum of a transformation program that can take years, not just months.
Great, thanks for that, Darren. Yeah, I think at this point we're coming towards the end of the session, but I think there's been some fantastic points made, and I think those were some very good points to end on. So one of the really big issues that we're dealing with is just communicating these risks in business language and making people realize that cybersecurity threats or attacks can result in potentially going out of business. So just making sure we get our heads around and a firm understanding of the operational risks we face, the legal risks we face, the reputational risks we face from these kinds of threats. And also, I think, as Gaurav mentioned, using language around data, talking about integrity of data, talking around availability of data, talking about the security of data, and just using this language more and more and more as companies digitize to a greater extent. Because over the next year, it's not going to get simpler. Obviously, the threat landscape's going to consider to become more complex, more sophisticated, and more challenging to deal with. And we will have to start using a lot of the tools that we've been discussing that do things like automate a lot of the activities that take place in a SOC, because the skills to do that are just not there. The current levels of productivity of analysts, by and large, I know I'm generalizing here. I know some companies might say, well, look, we're fine, but by and large, the productivity levels, of analysts are just not high enough. And the threat hunting capabilities that organizations are going to need to proactively get out there and make sure that they're on top of all the potential threats that they face are going to become more important than ever as companies start to build up resilience rather than just seeking to prevent known threats. So just become much more resilient in this digital world that we're moving into. So on that note, I'd like to thank all the panelists, Darren, Gareth, Lucas, Gaurav, and Sharif. I'd like to thank you very much for some great contributions to what has been a very stimulating and interesting discussion. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much.